What if I told you that the way that you use language every day had the power to either uphold or disrupt social injustices? What if I told you that because language is saturated with history and culture and memory, the way that it is policed within our classrooms and our communities is deeply connected to racism and colonialism? You see, when I was 19 years old, I sat on a panel for a room full of high school students. And a woman in the room stopped me in the middle of speaking, and she said, I'm sorry to stop you, but I just want you to know that you are so articulate. And in that moment, she meant it as a compliment. A friend of mine next to me was like, boo. And I was offended. And most people can understand that. Most people say, well, you were offended because you're a young black woman in this space, and this woman found it exceptional that you were mastering standard English. But there's another reason why I was offended. I imagined if this woman heard me speaking with my family who's Trinidadian in Caribbean Creolized English, would she have determined something else about my intellectual capacity? Or if she heard me speaking with my friends in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, in African American English, would she have determined something different about my worth? And in that moment, I understood that the answer was yes. And that deeply disturbed me. It actually became the impetus for my first TED Talk, 3 Ways to Speak English. It actually became the impetus for my research as a social scientist, analyzing the intersections of language, race, and power. You see, I'll share this story, and you got to work with me because it's about a man and a lion, and they're talking, all right? Work with me. So the man and the lion are walking through the jungle together, and they're arguing about who's the strongest. And the lion says, I'm the king of the jungle, I'm stronger than you. And the man says, I'm the king of the world, I'm stronger than you. And they're having this fruitless argument until they stumble upon a picture, still in the jungle, keep working with me, right? And the picture is of a man defeating a lion. And the man says, you see, I told you I'm stronger than you. And the lion says, yes, but who drew that picture? What has become important to my work in working with historically marginalized communities at the intersections of language, race, and power in education is interrogating who authors the dominant narratives and the dominant framings in our societies, in our schools, in our classrooms, in our world. It's important to know that in exploring and doing this research on language, race, and power, I stumbled upon some really interesting contradictions. You see, what I know of myself is that the multiple literacies that I bring to the table, my composite linguistic identity gives me power. But when I enter into institutional spaces, into classroom spaces, that power is not valued and often stripped away. In these spaces that claim to celebrate diversity, that claim to want to celebrate diverse culture, what instead happens is a perpetual invitation to engage in cultural erasure. But I found some contradictions in exploring these questions both contextually and historically, right? So in the social context of now, one of the contradictions I found was with the McDonald's slogan. Who knows the McDonald's slogan? I'm loving it, right? I'm loving it. We know that. What I found in my research is that this slogan is participating in a feature of African American English called consonant variation, the dropping of the letter G. This very statement, I'm loving it, this very feature, this consonant variation is something that would be corrected within a classroom space if I were to write it on my paper. Yet this billion-dollar corporation is able to utilize this linguistic practice for mass appeal and to capitalize on this cultural form of expression. I found another example in the show Modern Family. You know, I love that show. And there's this episode called She Crazy, which is weird because, like, there's not a lot of people of color in the show, right? And so I'm looking at the episode, and throughout the episode, everyone's, she crazy, she crazy, she crazy. And I'm like, okay. I do my research. Brilliant scholars have shown us that another feature of African American English exists there called copular absence, the absence of the verb to be. These features that have been asserted and designated and researched by linguists for years have been established as features of African American English that directly connect to the West African languages that they are historically rooted in. These language practices are valued in particular spaces, but there's a contradiction with what happens in institutional spaces, right? And there's a history here. I trouble up this issue because it is resonant with a history that is deeply rooted in racism and colonialism. There's a West African author. His name is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I speak of him often. He wrote this book called Decolonizing the Mind. He speaks about his time existing in colonial Kenya. He was there before Kenya was colonized. He said there was a time when the language of the classroom and the language of the community were one, but then came a colonial education. He said Berlin of 1884 was affected through the sword and the bullet, right? But the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. He said the bullet was the means of physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. What would happen is, if you were caught speaking your mother tongue, Gikuyu, in the classroom, in colonial Kenya, you would either be physically beaten or you would have to wear a sign around your neck that said, I am stupid or I am a donkey. It was very important to the colonial subjugation process that the language of the people who were being oppressed was divorced from the community. Those are some of the practices that we reiterate today. When I talk about liberation literacies, the work that I do with educators across our country, it's because that historical and contextual dissonance that I'm bringing up plays out right now in our world. I work with members of historically marginalized communities. Young Black people who say, yes, I engage in Black literacy practices, but in places where I feel safe. A sense of fugitivity exists there that has historical resonance in American chattel slavery, a time when it was illegal for Black people in this country to be able to read and write. A lot of that resonates with what's happening today in our classroom and in our world. There are so many ways to engage in racism. There are so many ways to engage in oppression. There are wonderful scholars who say language is a site of cultural struggle, right? And if we think about that, if we think about what it means in our institutional spaces to continue participating in the erasure and the oppression of people from historically marginalized groups, instead of incorporating, validating, and celebrating who they are in these institutional spaces, then we do a disservice to ourselves and to our world. So a lot of times when I bring up this conversation, that question of standard English as the language of power comes about. Which is why I brought up the McDonald's example, which is why I brought up the spaces where this power exists. There's a wonderful book called Articulate While Black that speaks about President Obama's ability to navigate multiple languages and literacies, and that centrality, the centrality of that was essential to the success of his campaign. You see, a lot of times you hear the word minority to refer to people who look like me. But I'm a member of the global majority.